Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Broadcast PR, Making It More Than Just a Numbers Game. My name is Philip Smith, and I'm the Head of News and Content at Gorkana, and I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar. I'm also delighted to be joined by two special guests, one from each side of the broadcast industry. With us, we have Tim Johns, who is producer on BBC Radio 2's Jeremy Vine Show, which I'm told over the last few years has been the biggest news show on radio. And we also have Phil Caplin, who's Director of Good Broadcast, the Broadcast PR Specialist. Phil, Tim, welcome to the webinar.
Hello.
Welcome. Phil and Tim are going to give us a presentation in a minute, which they will present tag team style. But before they do, and before they start that, I want to explain a little more about who they are and what they're going to be talking about. Phil heads up Good Broadcast, and he and his team work with brands to deliver coverage on TV, radio, and online. His specialism is understanding brands and how broadcast can be best used to deliver key messaging across top-tier coverage. He's worked with brands including Royal Caribbean, HSBC, Weetabix, and Nationwide. On the other hand, Tim Johns is a producer and reporter for the Jeremy Vine Show on BBC Radio 2. Previously, between time spent at BBC Radio Lincolnshire and Radio Humberside, Tim has worked as a broadcast journalist, station sound producer, presenter, producer of BBC Introducing, breakfast show producer, and the main cover presenter, producer of Thrive Time. He also says he occasionally makes his own stupid videos to stick on YouTube when he has the time. He also tells me he has a degree in geography, which I assume helped him navigate the wilds of Lincolnshire and Humberside when he was in those roles. But I'm not sure Tim will be talking about all of that today, but certainly what Phil and Tim will be talking about at the heart of today's webinar is a question. If broadcast plays such an important role in setting the news agenda for the day, why is it so often seen as the forgotten media channel or an afterthought in a communication schedule? Phil believes this oversight can lead to missed opportunities. So today, with Tim's help, he's going to survey the current UK broadcast marketplace, including national and local outlets, and highlight the opportunities for communicators to explore and capitalise on. They'll discuss how expertise and consultancy is far too often overlooked in favour of a PR fixation on coverage and numbers for the lowest cost. Some of the questions and topics our expert broadcast duo will tackle in this webinar include the best way to plan and execute a broadcast communications strategy, how attainable is national and local TV coverage, the benefit of forward planning to a story, how to avoid a broadcast schedule of all small stations, and the do's and don'ts when contacting broadcast media yourself. However, we don't want to just get those answers. I know that everyone in this webinar might have their own queries as well, so I urge everyone to use the panel on the right-hand side of their screens. Please send us your questions as the webinar progresses, and I'll make sure that we have time for as many of them to get answered as possible at the end. And I'm sure Phil and Tim will help us follow up if we don't get through them all. So please do send in your questions. So we're going to start in a minute with a 20-25 minute presentation, and then we'll make sure we have at least 10-15 minutes for those questions at the end, and even more if you have them. We look forward to hearing from you. Anyway, I think that's more than enough from me at this stage. Phil, please start the presentation.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks everybody for tuning in. As Philip says, this afternoon, Tim and I are going to give a short broadcast masterclass where we'll explore the power of broadcast and what the landscape of TV and radio looks like today. How broadcast can work most effectively for you, and most importantly, how to deliver the coverage that is realistically achievable. So, as we see, let's start at the beginning. At the point where you're planning a campaign in its infancy and plans have been put together, my question to everybody is broadcast even in your thoughts? Are you thinking, I'd like to be on BBC Breakfast, I'd like to be on the Jeremy Vine Show? And if you are you then thinking how you go about delivering that coverage? And if it isn't, why isn't it? One of the things I want you to take out today is that every story is different and needs to be approached in a bespoke way. Therefore, it's crucial to ask these three basic questions when analysing which broadcasters should be targeted for your story. So firstly, quite obviously, who is your target audience? And in the broadcast landscape, where do you find them? Which station is it, and which type of formatting is it then? So if you know it's the BBC, that's what you want. What is it the right format for that show? So broadcast leads the news agenda. It's most impactful first thing in the morning, and it's the first media people really interact with. So I was going to sort of bring Tim in at this stage and just ask Tim, obviously at the BBC, how he thinks sort of breakfast broadcasts such as BBC Breakfast and Good Morning Britain, the Today programme, lead the day's news agenda, in your opinion.
Well, I was surprised when you even invited me to this, that the premise was that broadcast isn't always at the forefront of any campaign. That's incredible, because obviously the first thing anyone does when they get up in the morning, most UK adults, I would say, is flick on the TV or flick on the radio. And so they might later read one newspaper of their choice a bit, but on a daily basis, it's the Today programme they're hearing, or Chris Evans, who might, mention a few bits of news here and there, but crucially, the news bulletin on radio too. That's where you want to be. And so, whether it's BBC Breakfast while you're having your cereal, or the Today programme while you're shoving the kids in the car, that completely sets the news agenda for most ordinary people. That's the thing the things they hear on those programmes are the things they're going to talk about at work. It's not what they necessarily see on page 30 of The Guardian.
And I also was going to ask you, as far as producing on one of the largest radio news shows that there is, what sort of clout a broadcaster like Jeremy and the show has, not only within the BBC but also with other key stakeholders and opinion formers?
It's very, every bit of the media landscape has its own place, right? And with some provide more measurable statistics than others. So if you go on, Good Morning Britain and they put a clip of your thing on YouTube, you can say, well, the audience watching was this, and then we got all at 300,000 views on YouTube, which is wonderful. If you come on our programme, for example, our audience don't tweet a lot. They maybe use Facebook a bit. We're not going to do a YouTube video. You're not going to have many good stats to take away, but we reach so many people that, it's not too much of an overstatement to say that is then what the nation is talking about. Literally in service stations where truckers are pulling up, and in the hairdresser, and in just normal people, normal places, it's truly agenda setting, even though you can't always see the numbers.
And over 7 million listeners each week, and the simple comparison, if you take a national newspaper, the listening figures for the major outlets, the major shows, is huge within broadcast versus some of the other media. It's not just all about sort of the recognisable outlets like the BBC and Sky that can deliver strong coverage, but also local radio. And again, I think there's sometimes a snob element to local radio, and it's a proven way to mobilise local audiences. Here's just a few stats of the percentage of all the radio listening in this area. So just to point the obvious out, if you wanted to reach people in Guernsey, and at some point I'm sure you would, then it's not a 5 Live, it's not a Jeremy Vine show, no disrespect, Tim, or Radio 1, but it's Island FM. Because for them, within that area, 49% of people are listening to that media outlet versus all the others. So it's a hugely efficient way to deliver your message. But TV obviously will always be the trophy coverage from a comms perspective that everyone desires. But can you really treat each outlet the same? Do they want the same things? And the answer is no. As a rough guide, programs like Channel 4, the 1, 6 and 10 o'clock news on BBC are looking for the more of the policy and issue-based stories, whereas the likes of Sky, BBC Breakfast, Good Morning Britain, they're really keen on the human interest piece. If you've got a case study, what's the visuals are about. It's also important to understand that within most of these shows, there are specific slots that will provide the opportunity for a guest to be invited on. So again, one word that will come up a lot is flexibility. And again, although as you can see on the screen, you've got all these national news outlets, all of these are slightly targeting their audiences differently. So Good Morning Britain, obviously very keen to have stories that are very female-focused. Channel 5 are trying to talk to a slightly younger audience. So again, for every campaign, you've really got to think, who's your audience and which of these are relevant? And we'll come on to what the assets you need are. However, this isn't a hard and fast rule, and I would say a good story will always be a good story. So how attainable is TV? Well, for me, it's important when you're planning your campaigns to take a top-down approach. As I mentioned earlier on, who's the major national TV and radio outlets that for you would be the one piece of coverage that you want? And from there, you want to look to how you reverse engineer your campaigns from there. So looking at our little checklist here, how many of these do you normally have for a story? Well, when all's said and done, I think nothing's more important than the top line, having a strong top line. But, have you got your story into the forward planning diaries? Do you even know when the BBC and other major outlets are having their planning meetings? What are the visuals for if you're looking to get onto TV? Have you even got any visuals? If there is filming opportunities, are you filming? Are you expecting the media to come down and send a crew at an expense? And if it's sofa-based, have you got something to sit on the sofa? And pointing the obvious out, BBC Breakfast has been up in Manchester for a while now. So if you are able to get onto BBC Breakfast and your main spokesperson is in Manchester, have you got anybody left in London that's then going to pick up the rest of the interviews that will need to be done? And, celebrities are great to have on board, but do they work for every story? Yes, it can open up slots on the likes of a Loose Women or a weekend sofa-based show, but if it's just a random celebrity with little relevance, then that's going to be a problem. So Tim, the radio landscape, do you want to give us a little insight?
Yes, I mean, every single program is hugely different. That's probably the key thing that I want to get across. So, one of the biggest, I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but one of the biggest mistakes any PR company would ever make is to send the same press release to 100 different journalists. I've got a mailing list of all the different people and places, I'll send it off. It's like every single program has its own DNA. So you have to look at each network. So, for example, Radio 2 and Radio 4, just to talk about BBC, are massively different. They have very different agendas in terms of the types of coverage you're going to get for a news story on Radio 2. Obviously, you look at the Jeremy Vine show on Radio 4. There are lots more news programs, but if you listen to them, some really, really, really only talk about that day's, in inverted commas, hard news, and maybe the thing you're pitching is not going to get on there, in the month of Sunday. So you just have to look very closely at each show, look at how many spots, if you like, there are on that. If one massive show only covers 2 things a day, then maybe your chances are more limited. But likewise, if you listen to, say, 5 Live, where they are churning through huge amounts of content every single day, and they can't all just repeat what the other show did about whatever topic. If you can add to that and offer them something, they'll sometimes bite your hand off. So just to understand how large and varied the landscape is really important. One key thing in terms of what we want, which you mentioned, is do you have a spokesperson available? A good spokesperson who's not just going to trot the party line, but just sounds interesting, sounds fun. Are they a great talker? Can you convincingly phone someone up or send them an email and say, you've got to have this person on because they're brilliant? That's the spokesperson you want.
So how do we deliver top-tier coverage on radio? Well, for me, landing radio coverage is not difficult. There's 400 radio stations, and getting bums on seat onto a schedule, numbers, is not a difficult thing. However, what clients want and what you want are top-tier coverage. And the top-tier coverage for me is not just national radio or the BBC badge, but as we're saying, it's the right coverage, the right campaign. So for me, it's about making sure that you're looking at the quality in all senses of quality, and that's not just about reach, that's about the right audience for you. And one of the things I also think is broadcast isn't always right for for a story. So don't just tick a box, because I think radio is a very easy way to tick a box. So make sure it is the right medium, and make sure you're honest with what the story's like and what's realistic. If in your heart of hearts you know a story's not right for 5 Live or the Today programme, then think about your client and the reputation by offering that story, as Tim was saying, because at the point that you might have the right story, people might look at you and think, these guys haven't got a clue, because the amount of releases that like Tim is getting through are ridiculous, I would say, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, hundreds a day is not, a lot of them are now filtered into my spam box because it's physically impossible to look at them all. So if you spot a name that you've sort of seen and there's one every day or every other day that I know is not even personally to me, they haven't thought about me, then what's the point in reading it? So you need to pick and choose how you do it and who you approach.
I must say, my favourite story was a client that I know approached Newsbeat with a story around a classical music concert, and the senior producer at Newsbeat was none too pleased, and it again sets that tone as far as that PR person offering other stories moving forward. But it's not all about sort of forward planning stories. One of the broadcast strengths is the ability to turn opportunities around quickly. So again, reacting to the news agenda and providing new and different views to a story can deliver huge impact. So when you're waking up in the morning, you're seeing what's on the news agenda, how is this relevant to me, my brand, my clients, and can we turn spokespeople around quickly and have that flexibility we're talking about to potentially land coverage at short notice? And again, this is about picking off one-off pieces of coverage. This, in a nice way, is speaking to someone like Tim, who's got a lunchtime show, saying, "Here's a story in the news at the moment. I've got an interesting voice that's going to continue this story, on from breakfast. And what it's not about is trying to then quickly get a spokesperson into a radio studio and try and do 10, 15 interviews between 9 and 1. This is about strategically, in fact, picking off, quick wins."
There's a lot of forward planning desks in and around the BBC. Oddly enough, actually, the Jeremy Vine show, we're quite a small team. We don't have one, but a lot of places do. The bigger the news outlet, I mean, the BBC is not one thing. There's a planning desk for Today programme. There's a planning desk for, I think a few individual programmes at 5 Live have one, as well as a central news one. Any major or even minor TV show has a planning desk. So if you can look for the programmes that don't necessarily only cover the day's news and also have features or what's clearly planned news, and get in touch with their planning desk, and don't just phone them up and say what's the email address for your planning desk? Can I speak for planning? Say, I'd like to pitch you selective stories in the future. What's the best way to do that? No one has ever phoned me up and asked me that, because every desk has a different answer. I've got a different answer, which is always email me, because we don't have forward planning working on today's show. Planning desk would say, I'm a forward planner. I'd like to speak to you every time. There's always a different answer, so you want to target it closely. On the Jeremy Vine show, yes, we are busy working on the day's programme. Often you have to get in really early if you've probably related to that day's news if you've got an event. When I worked at Radio Lincolnshire, Radio Humberside, there were forward planning teams. We did a mix of forward plan stuff and on the day stuff. And there's absolutely capacity in local radio schedules where often you have one presenter trying to fill 4 hours of news content to lap up a good offer.
So when you're getting in at 7:30 in the morning, you're looking at what's going on, and you're planning a show cold from 7:30, broadly speaking.
At the moment on the Jeremy Vine show, yes, we maybe have one thing set up, but obviously for a national show there's a lot of competition for that one slot. But in local radio, when I used to cover Present Drive Time, I mean, if you can come in and I've got 12 things I'm going to talk about that day, there's got to be a mixture of stuff, and if you've got a few already that are in the bag, or at least you can look at the diary and go, that is happening. Oh, maybe I'll do that actually, that's great.
So obviously once broadcast is a consideration, who's deciding what success looks like? Who's putting those KPIs in place to say, this is realistic? We understand who our audience is. We know what broadcasters we should be speaking to. Therefore, it's realistic that we are targeting certain media outlets. But who's crafted the story at the point of who's delivering the selling? So who's crafted the story? Who's provided those assets? Who's been involved in research that you've done? Who's sourced that spokesperson? Does anybody know that spokesperson, if it's a third party spokesperson, has done other activity recently? Because at the point of the selling, the media relations, it's important that there's a realistic expectation of what can be delivered. Of course, nothing is guaranteed within PR and broadcast. However, everybody wants national coverage. It doesn't always mean it's realistic. And as we're saying, there's huge competition out there for very, very few slots. And most importantly for me is if you're targeting, for example, an 18 to 35 audience, why is success dependent on landing BBC coverage when they're targeting a 40, 45 plus audience? Surely commercial radio is right. So again, it's about people understanding who the right people to target are and where the best results can be got. And it may be that some of the commercial radio stations have smaller audience reach, but are far more indexed against your audience. So I just want to take you through 3 quick case studies just to give you an example of how this comes together. The first one was for Aldermore Bank. They were keen to promote their savings products, and bear in mind at the moment interest rates are so low, savings accounts are delivering very, very little return. So what's that story? The client also wanted TV, like everybody. So the key for us was come up with a strong top line, which was all around the rise of the old entrepreneur, i.e. older people who are looking to get a second job to increase their income. And for us, we identified the right spokesperson, which, as you can see, was Nick Ewer. But also, and equally important, the right time for this campaign. And so we did this in the run-up to the Apprentice final. We also engaged with Good Morning Britain, who's shown a keen interest in the story, and worked 2 weeks out to land this piece of coverage. And then off the back of that, then landed additional coverage across the likes of GNS and national BBC radio. Second story was with Deloitte. Now, our brief was to generate coverage around the launch of a major report by Deloitte into problems faced by veterans trying to secure a meaningful job. The study by Deloitte, and they teamed up with Armed Forces charities, Forces in Mind Trust and the Officers Association, was one of the biggest of its kind into employees' attitudes towards veterans. We used our extensive contacts to secure top-tier coverage on a range of broadcast outlets, and we had spokespeople from Deloitte, from the Armed Forces charities, and they were getting coverage across the likes of Channel 4 and Sunrise. Now, the key here was Channel 4, landing Channel 4 was challenging because there wasn't a natural filming op. However, working with the journalists there, we knew that the issue was really key for them. So therefore, what we did was work with them to create softer filming ops, utilising different case studies, plus our branded spokesperson, to put together a 5-6 minute package. The other key outlet was with Radio 1 Newsbeat. This was hugely important because of the strong following of squatters that it has. And again, by working with a reporter there within Newsbeat, who had a wider parameter within the BBC, not only did we get Newsbeat, but also 5 Live and through the GNS, landing lots of local BBC coverage. And then finally, the National Pharmacy Association. Last year, the government announced that it was looking to cut £170 million from local pharmacies. And since then, we've been working together to lobby the government to change their stance. The key has been keeping the story in the news. Bear in mind, fundamentally, the story hasn't really changed. So therefore, making sure we had a continued calendar of proactive ideas where we could get the messaging across, but supported with newsjacking. So when the BBC recently did a whole week looking at the NHS, we were then able to pick off one-off pieces of coverage across the likes of BBC News Channel and Radio 4 You and Yours to add the value there. And then from a local level with this, what was really key was then utilising very local radio across BBC and commercial channels to target constituencies where key politicians who were involved in this decision process were. The key was always offering expert voice and filming opportunities with little notice and utilising the large resource of local pharmacists to provide commentary on how it will impact the local community. So you'll be glad to hear we're nearly there. So a little takeout for everybody, from what we've talked about today. What's like a checklist for a perfect broadcast strategy? Well, for me, it's 6 really important things. We keep saying it's understanding your audience, but then understanding programming and where you can get your client onto. It's about forward planning, not leaving it to the last minute, and making sure that that headline stands out. Make sure the spokesperson is relevant, and most importantly, that last point is making sure that you offer flexibility. So, having been in the industry for nearly 20 years, I thought it would, as a sort of final piece, I thought it would be good to ask some broadcast journalists what they thought about sort of broadcast PR and the approach that agencies like ourselves make and others. And there were 3 common mistakes that some agencies made, and I think it's important that when you put together your plans and potentially work with other agencies, these things, really, you bear these in mind. It's important to have consultants who have worked within broadcasters at the highest levels, who therefore know senior broadcast journalists that can start conversations far easier. They also understand what's needed for a story and appreciate they don't need to be harassed and chased to land coverage. I think the second thing that came out from the research was that despite that people speaking to the media are involved from the start of the creative and planning process, and not just, quite honestly, media relations machines. So many people, sounded like they were just picking up the phone with a release and didn't understand the story or even understand what the client behind it was trying to communicate. And then finally, what was shown was be respectful of the media. Too many journalists talked about being sort of, harassed by people, and in the end, if the story is strong, then send it over, put the call in. But again, why be offered 5 or 6 stories when surely one story is important? And for you, the client, that's the most important thing.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Tim. We've now got plenty of time to tackle your questions. So please do, using the panel at the right-hand side of your screen, do continue to send those in. I can see that quite a few have come in already, but please do send us more questions and we will get to them in turn. However, before we do that, I'm going to start by asking a question to you, Tim, about broadcast as a specialism. And I think it was just the whole premise of this webinar is that broadcast is different. I'm starting with you. Is broadcast journalism really different? As we see convergence and broadcasters are producing content online now as well as offline, do you see yourself as a broadcast specialist? Do you see that as a specialist journalist attribute? I suppose the blunt way of putting it is, how do you describe yourself at dinner parties?
I think broadcast is converging a bit in some areas. If you look at a newsbeat journalist on Radio 1, they're not going to go out and go and record something for radio, often without doing a little bit for Facebook and maybe an iPlayer doc to go with it and an online piece and everything else. I describe myself as a radio producer and reporter, definitely with the word radio in there. I've never properly done TV, and I do find at the inverted comma higher levels on national TV and stuff, most of the reporters and correspondents, yes, they do a bit of everything, but they've all got a speciality. So mine is definitely radio. I make a lot of radio packages, and that's a speciality that is all about radio. So it's converging a bit, but I think broadcast, breakfast, chat TV is its own specialism. I think a live radio news program is its own, and a consumer affairs radio program is another beast entirely. So,
great, thank you. Now, we've got some great questions here. I'm going to start off with the first one, which is, who is it best to contact? And Phil, I'll come to you on this first. And the question is it best to contact the producer of the show or the researcher?
Again, I think Tim would say that, it depends on the specific show. So, there's
no general rule.
There's no general rule. But I think what's key is that you're talking to the people that are putting the shows together. There's, on some shows you'll have junior people, and actually what you want is decision makers that are making the decisions, especially on the bigger shows.
Yeah, great. And Tim, actually, before I let you answer that, I'm going to ask you another question, which is exactly similar, but let's get this question answered as well, which is, who are the best people to target at a radio station? Is it producers, planners, presenters, researchers, etc.? As I've experienced quite a variation in my career. Thank you.
The industry is an absolute nightmare for knowing what a job title means. So a producer can mean literally anything, really, to be honest. It could be someone who makes tea at one station, and it could be the absolute most senior person on the network at another station. So I go back to what I said earlier, which is get in touch with the organisation and say, I would like to pitch to this programme. How do I best do it? Ask that question. Make that your first question. When I worked in local radio, if I was cover presenting the news drive time programme, that's it. I'm it. So you'd be contacting the presenter. Right now, if you try to ask for the Jeremy Vine Show researcher, well, we have producers who do research, but technically we don't have a researcher. So you never know. You need to get in touch with the programme and ask who is best for each and every programme.
And again, I think, a lot of what we do is common sense, but, if you're going to call Tim, don't call him, at 11:45, which is about to go on air at 12 o'clock. Likewise, if you're speaking to a commercial radio station in the newsroom, don't be calling at 5 to the hour or 5 past the hour, give them a chance to do their job. So again, just a little bit of common sense goes into sort of speaking to the right people at the right times.
Great. Tim, you won't be surprised, we've got lots of questions about the Jeremy Vine Show. This first question is, my question is to Tim, how important is having the exclusive for the Jeremy Vine Show? When is the best time to get in touch? Which Phil has just answered, but how important is it exclusive?
See, again, every single programme is so very unique. So this is by no means an answer for other programmes. This is very specifically for us. The annoying answer is it depends. And the fairly honest answer is not particularly. A lot of programmes are like, well, we're only going to do it if we'll speak to them first. Because we are very different to a lot of programmes, we speak to 7 million adults who listen to Radio 2. They're not listening to the Today programme, most of them that morning. They're not necessarily seeing a lot of the other outlets. We're quite standalone, so we're happy to go a bit later with stuff. If it's brilliant and we can run it, we'll run it.
I was going to say, do you not find in broadcast though, versus say print media, the exclusive is less important? So with newspapers, you'll see that newspapers have exclusivity. With broadcasters, they're not as precious.
Yes, although it does entirely vary. I mean, yes, you're right on the one hand, but again, it's programme by programme. So often oh, that's a great story. Let's speak to that person. We phone them up and they're like, oh, I've got a contract with GMB because they've got money and we haven't. So it varies.
Great, thank you both. Now, this sort of relates to that, and the question is, do you prefer things to be embargoed or not? And actually, I think, Tim, this is related to people's working hours. So the question from the same person was, how do you land weekend coverage if you only work Monday to Friday? And then the follow-up is, do you prefer things to be embargoed or not? So in your experience, how do you land that weekend coverage? Can you set things up? And do embargoes in general, do they work?
If you're forward playing a news story, I think definitely embargo it. Because, as I say, we're not precious about the exclusive, but any good coverage is going to come from what Phil said much earlier, which was a good story will always be a good story. It's all about a good news line. And if you've got a good news line and you put out an email in a tiny outlet, you might have quite a moderately small outlet running your story, and suddenly loads of the big ones the next day go, oh, it was on there yesterday, we won't do it. So an embargo does help. If it's a genuinely good story, no one will mind doing it at the same time as everyone else, but a lot will mind if they're late to the party. So an embargo is good. And weekend news coverage, yeah, again, that's more about forward planning, but Phil probably does more of that than me.
Well, I was going to say, I think the weekend opportunities, again, are to some extent missed opportunities, which is why the question I think is being asked. If you take something like, Sky News, the opportunity to land a piece of coverage on Sky News at the weekend is actually far easier than during the week. So if your story lands on, well, whichever day, but Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, is it still a good piece of coverage if you land a piece of coverage on TV, on Sky TV, on Saturday or Sunday? And if the answer is yes, then have a second bite of the cherry, because with a lot of broadcasters, it's a whole different planning team, different, radios, different shows, different producers, different formatting. So again, it totally depends, but I think there's huge opportunity, especially in TV, where it's quieter because, again, PRs aren't offering as many stories.
Yes, yes. Okay. Now, we've got a question here about international stories and how they get coverage, and in this case, it's regional coverage for an international story. So, Phil, I'll come to you first on this, and this is, do you have any top tips for getting coverage of an international story, e.g. charity work happening overseas, on regional broadcast media, aside from finding a local spokesperson or someone delivering that work?
I'm trying to read the question, can't see it. But if what we're saying is the question is a charity, an overseas charity,
yeah,
and you are looking for UK coverage, then the challenge that you have is finding the relevance to that local audience. If I'm in my hometown in Leeds and I'm listening to BBC Radio Leeds, then for all the amazing work that you may be doing or will be doing overseas, why is BBC Radio Leeds interested in sharing that with their listeners? Where's the local angle? Therefore, the chances are it's going to be more of a national story, and it certainly will be an international story from what you're saying.
Okay. Great. Tim, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of international stories and how you make them resonate?
I would say that the absolute blunt, honest truth is Radio Leeds and Radio Humberside probably not. I mean, it is a local connection. It's got to be that. Don't try and fabricate one if not, because you see it a mile off.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question here, which is about business-to-business coverage, and I guess it's about basically business stories, particularly when you look at, I think in this case it's marketing. So, Tim, shall I come to you first on this? Our business marketing is business-to-business. Are national broadcast outlets interested in business-to-business? Or does it have to be more generic and suitable for all? Which I guess means suitable for consumer. There's a consumer angle at the heart of it.
I'm going to be slightly evasive and say, in specifically where I work on the Jeremy Vine show, the phrase business to business is already a turn off. So, I mean, for us, you've either got a great story that is suitable for our audience, which is a national audience who, it's got to be generally brilliantly interesting, whatever it is, and not too niche, or not. So that's a bit of a vague answer, but
and I would say there are opportunities. I think it totally depends on who you are, what you're trying to say. But if you're trying to talk to a certain audience, and there is something in the news that you can jump on a bandwagon of, and having a view on that is directly linked to your business, then without knowing any specifics, there is a way to create a national story. That means you don't have to pitch as a business-to-business story. So Tim, doesn't fall asleep immediately, and it's something that hopefully has some sort of national piece and national opinion that you can talk about. So there are ways.
Great, thank you both. Tim, we've got a question coming up on social media and how that's affecting broadcast media and the content used. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you both a question about the food and drink sector. And what sort of stories have worked, and which sort of pitches have worked, if you have any experience of that. Phil, I'll come to you first on this. And the question is, I work within the food and drink sector and work with restaurant, bar, and pub clients. What kind of stories have worked in the past in broadcast? Do you have any experience of that? I know you've covered loads of different sectors. I was thinking, does Weetabix count? Because that's an FMCG brand, but I don't know, you don't get that in many bars and pubs, do you? But,
yes, I remember doing a campaign for the likes of Walkabout around dating and how, what the way you hold your drink, what it says about you. But the story that comes to mind that I always enjoy the most, I mean, it's very topical, which is around seasonality in turkeys. And it's amazing. We do a lot of work with turkey clients. And just before Christmas, we always get a lady on to talk about how to cook your turkey best. And it's really straightforward, and it's all about providing advice. And what's amazing and it's what I love about broadcast journalists, is even some of them, and I won't name names, but there are some presenters that I now know hate turkey. And they always start that interview by reminding us, who have done this story for many years, that they hate turkey. And you always get a bit worried, and then it's like, however, let's talk about this turkey that everyone wants to eat in the next few weeks, and it lands really good coverage, because it's not about what the presenter's view is. He knows that the story is nice, topical, and relevant, and therefore you always get a nice pickup.
Brilliant. We've got a great question here, which must be for Tim, and it's totally on the same subject, but actually takes a slightly lateral approach to it. And this is, how do you feel about having food and drink products sent to you? Tim, how do you feel about having food and drink products sent to you?
Very good.
Excellent.
I will add to that. A lot of stuff comes into the radio too, and editorially it's difficult to mention lots of it. However, that said, there's like National Pie Week, and National Sausage Week, and Donut Week, and
we can see what Tim wants sending in.
Pie,
sausages, donuts.
All that stuff comes in, and actually, I'll tell you what, there's always some presenter who ends up going, "Oh, more donuts, brilliant!" So it's a gamble. They're probably not going to mention your brand. They might, if it's not too much of a cost for you. Why not?
Excellent, thank you. Now, there's a question here about spokespeople, which I think is interesting, particularly Phil, with the 3 case studies that you mentioned. I think there was one celebrity spokesperson that was featured there with Nick Hewer. And this question, and I'll come to you first on this, Phil, is it vital to have a well-known spokesperson in order to get pickup? I.e., how do you make the story appeal more to a broadcast without a famous spokesperson?
Yeah, no, I don't think you need a celebrity. I think the point with celebrities is, please just don't, if you've got all the money in the world, inserting a celeb here doesn't always work. It can work, of course, if it's a big enough name. But, there's got to be relevance to it. I think the best campaigns are when you have quirky spokespeople. I remember working with a Tintinologist. He knew more about Tintin than anybody. Yeah, Phil's looking at me, not having a clue. We're talking books. And I think, when you've got somebody quite niche and specialist as a spokesperson, I think that's great. I think one area where you always find a slight problem is with psychologists, because a lot of stories can be turned on its head to talk about, let's have a psychologist to talk about. But then all these different stories out there, it's like a psychologist's view. Is there a different voice that can go out there? So, no, it's not all about celebrities.
Excellent, thank you. Tim, I'm going to flip this slightly because this is about the well-known people on a show and how you pitch to them. So this one is, and this one's about medics. So broadcast media medics. Is it best to pitch the team or the media medic directly, e.g. Dr. Sarah Jarvis on the Jeremy Vine Show?
I go back to my earlier question, which is get in touch with someone at the station and say, how would you best like me to pitch stories to you? The answer to the Jeremy Vine Show is that all our medical specials, to which Caplin's referring there, are decided by the production team, so an email to someone like me would be best. Again, when we worked in local radio, we had people on the film show or the medical special or the vet special who they would, when everyone's having to really pitch in to come up with every single idea and bit of content, they would bring things to the table. So again, you need to ask that program who's making those decisions.
I guess also with medical subjects, sometimes you have to be very careful that it's not too jargon heavy, that it's something that's understandable to the public. We've got a question here about technology, actually, along the same line. So, Tim, I'll come to you on this. How can you make a technology pitch, a topic which covers quite heavy language and terminology, accessible for broadcast?
It's everything we said earlier, I suppose, about knowing the program. So if you're pitching to BBC Click, the technology program, they are going to enjoy all the funny words in your press release because they can understand it fully and then decide how they want to cover it. If it's coming to something much more broad and general, like you and yours or the Jeremy Vine Show, you're going to have to make that email completely suitable and easy to understand and have a great top line about how your bit of technology is going to change the world that we haven't heard before.
And I was just going to expand it slightly to things like, pharmaceutical, and health stories, and finance stories, sort of jargon-based areas. And again, if you can't explain what you're talking about in a sentence, like most stories, then you've got a problem, because a release that's sent to broadcasters is not 3-4 pages long with lots and lots of explanations. So if you've got lots of technical words, jargon, phrases that the general man on the street, which are the people you're trying to speak to, can't understand, then you're never going to get read.
Of course. This is great. We've got so many questions. We've still got another 5-10 minutes to go. And as you can tell, Phil and Tim are answering a broad range of subjects at the moment. And the other thing I would say is Tim's definitely going to keep an eye out for those barbecue products that someone has just promised. So keep your questions coming in. And I think the next thing we'll look at actually is how about social media? And Tim, I think this is specifically about Jeremy Vine, but it would be great to get your perspective on the wider social media issue. And that is, who runs the social media channels of the programme? Who decides what to post? And I guess therefore also is if someone's got something social media friendly, like, I don't know, a visual or something, who should they contact?
Again, I suppose all your favourite programmes that you want to get on, you want to go and look at what their offering is and decide whether it's worth it. So if you went to the Jeremy Vine show, you'd find all we do, quite simply, is do one post explaining what we're talking about per topic, one on Facebook, one on Twitter. We don't do much beyond that, and we let people fight out amongst themselves in the comments. You might find other outlets. I mentioned Newsbeat on Radio 1. They would be very keen if you had a great story for them. It was a genuine news story that you could also say, by the way, this would look amazing as a video on your Twitter exclusively. They're going to lap that up. So
yeah, we had a client recently on Newsbeat who they didn't take the story on air because it was quite commercial, but it was relevant for online. So again, it's understanding sort of the appeal, like most media being sort of converged, the sort of coverage that you can get, even if it's not on air.
Tim, this is very specifically aimed at you, and this is about the best pitch you've ever received. For Tim, what is the best pitch you have ever received, and why was it so effective?
Oh, it's like asking what your favourite film is. It's so hard. I can tell you about an effective one that was not necessarily the best ever, but I don't mean to put you on the spot, Phil. But Phil, for example, the first time I spoke to Phil, he phoned up and he said, I think it was the first time or second time he'd ever phoned me. And he said, look, we've got the Australian Trade Minister over, he's doing a thing, and do you want him? And it was just after Brexit had all kicked off and we were talking about doing trade deals. I mean, that's just brilliant because, the Australian Trade Minister for a current affairs programme on a relevant topic, it's like, oh, yes, please. I mean, that comes down to the quality of the guest. But it was a good pitch because Phil hadn't sent me 100 previously. He'd waited until
you got the most
the right moment. So that's what makes it a brilliant pitch.
It sounds also,
if that's not too embarrassing.
it sounds also, though, that was also important was it was a call and that it was quite a succinct pitch.
Yes, I mean, I actually normally would say never call. I mean, to be fair, Phil could have emailed me and I'd have still said yes, because when a story stands up or a guest stands up on its own, that's what matters the most. So for me personally, the call wasn't special, but I suppose my point is that I realised that Phil wasn't calling every day, but he'd chosen to this time, so it did make a difference.
I mentioned social media, and actually this is about visuals and how important they are. And this is, when sending a story into radio, do you still want visuals for your social media channels too? Tim, is that something where you sit there and say, please attach that?
Yeah, follow good common sense. Don't send a 20 meg video to everyone you're emailing, but an idea of always keep the top bit of the email personal and succinct. There's no harm in attaching or embedding a low-res copy if you've got a great image. If it's an image that you look at and go, oh, that's what makes the story, send it, because then the journalist just has to look at it and go, oh, yeah, right, I get it. We'll have that.
I think this is also for you, Tim. What is broadcast journalists' biggest bugbear with PRs? So you've talked about the good pitch. What's the biggest bugbear? What's the thing that you think is the biggest mistake that people generally make? What's the one thing you would cure tomorrow if you could give people advice on what to do?
Where to start? With respect. I'm I'm just trying to think what gets you into the blacklist. I think if somebody junior from a company phones our office at 11:40 and our program starts at 12 o'clock, and they pitch something that's not related to our program really, that we probably never covered in a million years, and they do the thing that they've been told, which is the journalist is going to want to cut you off. So when you pick up the phone, make sure you get your 60 seconds pitch in it uninterrupted. I mean, that's like whatever company you're from, I never want to talk to you again, probably. So I guess of all of that, I think the whole talking uninterrupted does wind me up personally.
And what winds you up in a spokesperson? What's the thing that you would say you've got to get right in a spokesperson, or the thing that when you suddenly go, actually no, this really is not the person we should have got or we'd want to use again?
Be careful. We all know we're all in this together. So if a spokesperson's coming on and they're from wherever they're from, okay, we know that. We don't mind that that's from a commercial organisation necessarily if we can editorially justify doing the story. So starting point, good story. And then just get your spokesperson to be brilliant, and that will do the job. On a big show like ours, we're going to introduce them and say where they're from. That's enough. The second they start saying, well, if you read the research from this company, XYZ, and they keep saying it, the audience aren't stupid. They can hear that, and it becomes, you lose the sense of the story, and you get distracted by the fact they're just trying to plug something. So don't overtly plug.
And also, that person, and if it is a brand spokesperson, like your example, it's a bit short-sighted, because what's brilliant is, in the example, you're on the Jeremy Vine show. Like you say, take your win, take your intro, take your mention, and then get your messaging across. Because if you do a good job, then the chances are you'll have other opportunities, you have other good stories. The second you start abusing it, especially with the BBC, then people just won't want to talk to you.
If we have one more thing, I do remember at Radio Lincolnshire once I did a pre-recorded thing, and be careful with pre-recorders because the spokesperson said the brand name like every other sentence. So I cut all the brand names out, and then it ran for about a minute. I had another one a week later where the spokesperson was great, it was an interesting story, so we ran like 7 minutes of it. So just be careful.
Yeah. We've got a couple more questions I think we can get answered before we finish, and I love this one because now you've just spoken about spokespeople. How about this? We're asking for 2 tips. I'm going to ask for 1 from each of you. Apart from the obvious, what 2 tips would you give to a spokesperson to help them sound relaxed? Phil, you're looking very relaxed at the moment, actually. But what's 1 tip you would give us?
I always say to enjoy themselves. Just enjoy themselves. Forget you're on radio. Imagine you're in a coffee shop chatting to somebody, because the spokesperson is the expert. They know their stuff. Therefore, just enjoy it.
What would you say, Tim?
Yes, you can practice with them in a room, but just do that to get them relaxed. Don't overload them with bullet points. Don't make them have to think about anything apart from maybe one key message that they don't just inherently know. If they know it, you can say to them, you know it, you're great, just, we'll have a chat about it so you're familiar with the subject, but don't overload them with stuff they don't have to think about and what they can and can't say. Just let them be an expert.
Yeah, I have to say from my own experience, particularly with public speaking, but also with broadcast, it's don't change the message at the last minute. That's the one thing that helps make people, less react, is giving them last minute advice and suddenly saying, by the way, remember to say this. And that really doesn't help people relax. Now, there's one thing that I think neither of you really have mentioned, though you've mentioned things that have made us laugh. But the question here is about the value of humour. So, Phil, in a pitch, does making the story fairly humorous help, if it's appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, not being the side of the person that is being pitched to, I would have thought humour is good, but it totally depends on what the story is. A little bit of light in today's world is always a good thing.
And Tim, how do you think about humour in that sense? That it's great, isn't it? I immediately make it not funny by getting you to think about humour. But do you sit there with the Jeremy Vine show and say, well, actually, we always want an and finally sort of funny type story, and we'd like at least one of those today, or is it something where you just take it as it comes?
We take it as it comes. Sometimes we cover the Syrian situation as our ender, Steve writes, over the moon. No, we take it as it comes. If it's a great story, it's a great story. Sometimes stories are great because they are inherently hilarious. Often because they're not obviously funny, but they're just a funny topic. Sometimes they're just a great story, great people, great characters, great top lines, important stories. I mean, one other thing I would say on that is a humorous story helps, but only if it's funny, and it's very hard to be funny. And if it's a bad joke, that probably makes it worse. So if you've got someone genuinely funny in your office, great, use them. If not, don't.
One of my favourite bits of radio from your show was when you built a shed in the studio, and that was just hilarious. To listen to it on air. I mean, I can only imagine what it was like in the studio. But again, that's not about a humorous top line, but just the premise of humour and making something so very visual on radio. That's again where it plays a strength.
Can I just say, I don't think it was Tim who built the shed, though, was it? A shed was built on the Jeremy Vine show.
It was.
I love how out of context that sounds completely mad.
Yeah.
but yeah, if you've been a shed company, and this isn't how it happened, but it could have, and you came to us and said, you haven't done a special on sheds. We know you do consumer stuff. We are down the road in London. Why don't we do something crazy like come into your studio and build a shed during the news? That or an email, if we hadn't already done it, I'd have thought, yeah, great. We love stuff in the studio, making noise and being ridiculous. Great.
Excellent. Now, we've got a bit of laughter there, but I'm not going to take that opportunity to end now. I'm going to ask you both for one final thing, and we are going to look through your questions, and I know there's one particularly a pro bono question, which I'm going to ask Phil to take offline and respond to the person who answered that separately. But thank you, everyone, so much for your questions. But I'm going to finish with just one thing. I'm going to ask each of our guests to say the one thing they want people to take away from this webinar today. You've covered so much ground. If there's one thing, and I'll start with you, Phil, in, let's say, a minute or less, could you just say what's the one thing you'd recommend people should take away from this webinar?
For me, it's less than a minute, just to think about broadcast. From the start, not as an afterthought, at the last minute, as a reason just to tick boxes to land coverage, but when you're starting out, right at the beginning, to think, should broadcast be on our plans? And if it is, where should we be targeting to reach our audience?
Excellent. Tim, what about yourself? What do you think is the one thing you would want to stress from today's webinar?
Probably quality over quantity at every step of the process. So understanding every program, making sure your top line is brilliant, making sure you're targeting the right people with relevant stuff, not carpet bombing everyone with rubbish. Quality over quantity, I think, always has to work.
Great. Actually, there is one question, because I think this might be a short answer from you, Tim. We're going to finish with this question that's just been sent in. What are your thoughts on PR saying, hope you're well, before a pitch?
I'm slightly worse now, thank you.
Excellent. I'm afraid the worst part of my role is that I always have to cut things like this short when I know we could go on for a lot longer. I do want to say, though, we'll be sending everyone who's registered for this webinar copies of the slides and those takeaways, and Phil's very helpful checklist for a perfect broadcast strategy. So do look out for those, and there will be a recording of the webinar as well. And I do hope that everyone who's been with us today has enjoyed it. Keep an eye out for our next Gorkana webinar in May. It's on the 17th to be exact, and that webinar is called Weathering the Storm, How Communications Teams and Individuals Can Build Resilience and Protect Mental Well-Being. Sign up for it at gorkana.com. But I'm going to finish with some big thank yous. I want to thank Phil and Tim so much for all their time and expertise today, and for particularly covering that wide range of questions. And I particularly want to thank everyone who sent in a question today. Thanks so much for helping us make this so interactive and so engaging. And thank you for everyone for listening in. Thank you. See you next time. The webinar is now over.